Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. This is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do in this video is talk about my main issue with the word evolution. Now we're going to need to define what this word means. And before we even get started, I want to say first, please just listen to my argument. I know there are a lot of people who like the idea of leaving a comment on a video without actually hearing what the argument is, and if you just wait like 60 seconds, there's a good chance I will at least make my argument clear so you'll know what at least you can respond to. So let's get started. My issue isn't the necessity of evolution via natural selection plus mutation or this sort of modern population genetics for explaining life, but rather the sufficiency of this theory alone. So I think actually evolution and natural selection have been demonstrated empirically. I don't think there's any reason to doubt this, and I would encourage people who do doubt this to look at the empirical evidence for this, because I think they've done some experiments with fruit flies. They've shown, hey, look, like genes do mutate. Hey, things, natural selection does happen. I mean, natural selection is almost a tautology. It's basically like things that are more likely to survive will survive. I mean, it's almost a useless statement, but it's not useless, I would say, because it does kind of say with mutation that those that are more well adapted to their environment will be more likely to pass on their genes, and then their offspring are more likely to survive, and these sorts of things. So I don't see any reason to necessarily doubt natural selection and mutation at contributing to the diversity of life. Rather, I think the thing that I'm skeptical of, and the thing that I would encourage other people to be skeptical of, is whether Neo-Darwinism, which is evolution via natural selection and modern population genetics alone, is enough to explain the variety and complexity we see in the natural world. So once again, it's not the necessity of this theory, it's the sufficiency of this theory at explaining what we have. And I also want to say this really doesn't have much to do with Christianity per se. I mean, it could very well be the case that all of life can be explained via natural selection and mutation, and still God exists, and still people have religious experiences, and still there's the resurrection, these other sorts of things. But I do think, if these things are sufficient for explaining it, it certainly would take away the design argument from the theist's toolbox for arguing for theism. So in that case, I think many theists are a little reluctant to give up on the design argument, and maybe are a little hostile. But I don't think there's any reason for saying that natural selection or mutation can play a role, and I don't think the theist or the Christian is necessarily giving up anything per se by allowing this to happen. But I do think we should be skeptical, whether we're Christian or not, that this is enough, that this theory alone is enough to explain all the life we have, all the different forms we have. So let's take a look at the Dissent from Darwinism statement. This is often used as part of the intelligent design movement, and it says, we are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Now, this is an interesting thing, and I don't know if I would have signed this statement personally, because I think it could have been worded a little bit better if it was me. I would have worded it like this: we are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection alone to account for the complexity of life. So you can say, hey, look, random mutation and natural selection have been demonstrated. Now you're not arguing about whether or not, there's research supporting it. I don't think there's any reason to doubt that. But rather the claim is this enough to explain all the theories we have? Now, one objection I could see coming is somebody saying, well, why do you need to invoke another causal explanation? Don't we have naturalistic or Darwinian explanations for everything that we have? And I'm actually not trying to do this. I'm not trying to invoke any other sort of causal explanation, although those who are associated with the intelligent design movement often do. And I would encourage people to actually read their literature, like Stephen Meyer's Signature in the Cell, these other sorts of books. I used to be very skeptical of intelligent design, and by actually reading these arguments, and you can thank Thomas Nagel for actually encouraging me to read these arguments, I started realizing, oh man, there's actually, they actually make some good points that are not easily answered, and we should at least be listening to these. But beside the point, this idea here is actually shifting the burden of proof. The Neo-Darwinist, the person who believes that Darwinism, natural selection, and mutation alone are sufficient to explain life, it is their job to prove that it is sufficient. It is not the person who's skeptical of this claim to offer some other sort of external explanation or anything. It's not our job to do this. It is the Neo-Darwinist who needs to show that these two theories alone can account for the complexity of life. And here's where I think we start running into some issues. So suppose natural selection plus this sort of modern Mendelian genetic theory was sufficient. How would we come to know this? I mean, how would we even establish this if it was true? Would there be some scientific experiment we could do to demonstrate its sufficiency? I mean, yes, we do have what I would consider to be plausible explanations for the existence of natural explanations or Darwinian explanations for a lot of things. But you could imagine a lot of other types of Darwinian explanations, even within Darwinism, that could be other explanations for what we have. And this is why I think many people are skeptical, because they look like just so stories. It's like, oh, here's a theory based on, anthropology studied on these particular groups, and we're just going to assume that this is what the causal mechanism was, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago in the past. And it's just so difficult to establish this. And whether or not you could even falsify this, whether or not you could create an experiment, these are all sorts of questions I think we should be asking. So the question is, why invoke another causal explanation? That's not the point. The point is whether or not these things are sufficient or good explanations, and how we would even come to know this in the first place. And if you're a skeptic, if you consider yourself a skeptic who likes being skeptical of claims, this is a pretty strong claim, and one I think you should at least be skeptical of. Once again, not the necessity of evolution, of natural selection, but the sufficiency of it. And consider, this is very similar to the skeptic who would say, suppose God does exist. How would we come to know? How would we even come to know either way? I think this similar sort of attitude, I think you should apply to the sufficiency of natural selection. I think it's very difficult to encourage this, even if it were true. Now, at the heart of this is an issue around scientific realism. And scientific realism is the idea that we should adopt a realist attitude around scientific theories, meaning we should believe that scientific theories produce true descriptions of the world rather than just useful approximations under so-and-so circumstances. So scientific realism is use a definition, our scientific theories produce models that describe reality truthfully or accurately. It's not just useful, it's not just a good approximation, but actually truthfully or accurately. So we're saying these models are actually true. And notice here that this is not a scientific claim. This is a metaphysical one, because science cannot distinguish whether or not science produces true statements. This would be arguing in a circle. You'd be presupposing that science did produce truths to try to prove this. So you need to basically argue this using some other method that's not science. And here's an article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on scientific realism. Very, very interesting. And it is widely held, not least by realists or scientific realists, that even many of our best scientific theories are likely false, strictly speaking, hence the importance of the notion that theories may be close to truth, that is, approximately true, even though they are false. So one of the problems around scientific realism is, even if you believe that science can, in principle, produce theories that accurately describe reality, even most of the people who would accept this claim, and I'm at least on this claim to the point that I think scientific theories in the limiting case will arrive at truth, even if many of our theories are false. But the point here is, being a scientific realist does not mean you are a realist about the current theories that we have. It's the idea that science will eventually produce truth as we continue iterating over our models, rather than accepting the model that we have now. He continues, the challenge of making these qualifications more precise, however, is significant and has generated much discussion. And he goes on to explain the people who are now maybe more cynical when it comes to philosophy of science to produce truth because of some of these sorts of reasons. And this is, I think, one of the main issues. Is it fair to be a realist about natural selection and mutation, or is there more to the story? Or are these mechanisms that work at a certain scale or at certain time periods but are not completely true? This is the question I'm trying to ask. And my issue is, how do we answer this question in principle? This is my issue with evolution. So let's take a look at some naturalistic or scientific explanations that have failed. Now, I'm not here to try to say you shouldn't trust science or be a science denier, but my point is to say one of the ways that science innovates is it produces theories, and then what it does is it tests these theories, and then there become data that don't fit this theory, so then science has this sort of self-correcting mechanism. But because it's self-correcting, this gives us a reason to at least doubt the current theories that we have in favor of what may be a better theory that comes in the future. So let's look at some of these reasons. And I have somebody asked for 6 of them, but I found 8 of them that I wanted to talk about. Spontaneous generation. This was refuted by Louis Pasteur in 1859. Spontaneous generation, the idea that life could just kind of appear out of organic matter. And Pasteur had an experiment that refuted this idea. Geocentrism, this was the prevailing Aristotelian idea. Galileo refuted this idea. Phlogiston theory, this was the idea that stuff had this basically inert potential to explode. And then we eventually learned about oxidation and learned that this is what actually causes things to explode rather than things kind of having its own potential. Vitalism, the idea that there's this sort of life substance or life serum in living things. This was refuted by our modern idea of DNA, Francis Crick, Watson, these guys. Newtonian mechanics, the idea that we have this law-like universe. This was refuted, actually. Black body radiation showed some cracks in this theory, and it wasn't until we have more quantum mechanics, these other types of things, that we were able to understand and better fit the data that we have. The emission theory of vision, this was the idea that when we see something, it is our eyes that shoot little particles out that see things, and this was refuted by the Islamic scientist Al-Hazen. This is actually a long time ago. Look at the contributions of the Islamic scientists during their golden age. A lot of great stuff in mathematics and things. They were way ahead of the curve there. Awesome stuff. The law of refraction, which was then refuted by Snell's law later. And the idea, for instance, and here's another one, that all swans were white, which was refuted by the Dutch explorer who eventually found a black swan. And I chose this last one as another theory because I think this one's really important, because the issue here is an issue around induction. The idea that we observe this stuff, it seems to follow some regular pattern, and we therefore generalize it, but are we justified really generalizing it given the fact that we've been wrong in the past about it? Now I want to focus a little bit on Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics, while it was thought to be true, is neither necessary nor sufficient for describing reality. So we now realize that Newtonian mechanics is an outdated picture of the world, even though we still teach it because it's useful. It's useful for describing things. It's useful for building things, even though we know it is false. Now, one objection that some people would say, and you can see this in this Stanford Encyclopedia article on scientific realism, is that quantum mechanics becomes Newtonian mechanics in the limiting case. So what scientific theories do, rather than refute each other, is they just create a broader system and specify more and more conditions. And that's an interesting thing to argue, but when it comes to Newtonian mechanics, it's very clear that the Newtonian picture and the quantum mechanics picture are incompatible. They're so different, they're incompatible. They actually make contradictory claims. Yes, Newtonian mechanics works at certain scales, and quantum mechanics basically reduces, for the most part, to Newtonian mechanics at certain scales, but its theory has been superseded and shown to be inadequate. For instance, Newtonian mechanics says it is impossible for me to run through a solid wall. Quantum mechanics says it is possible. It's very, very improbable, but it's still possible. So it's very clear these things do make contradictory claims, although under certain conditions you can kind of say, well, they're close enough. Maybe you can argue they're close enough that it doesn't matter for many cases. But once again, close enough for not mattering is not the same as being true, is not being the same as being absolutely true for what we care about if we're looking for truth. So once again, just because we can describe things at certain scales or something is useful doesn't mean it necessarily describes reality. And as a result, you could apply this in Neo-Darwinism. Why think, if we do accept this idea about scientific realism, that Neo-Darwinism corresponds to reality rather than being a useful model? Why think it is actually true? Now, why is this an issue? Let's talk a little bit about this. It has to do with induction. I'm skeptical of skeptics who call themselves skeptics but are not skeptical of these sorts of metaphysical claims. This is the problem here is around induction. And one of the problems that I think comes about is what atheist philosopher Michael Ruse talks about. What he says is Neo-Darwinism functions like a religion for those who believe it. And why he says this is because it answers questions about purpose, where we come from, where we are going, just like many other religious sorts of systems. And if you take this approach, it actually explains the hostility that many Neo-Darwinists have when you question its orthodoxy. It's very similar to people who question the authority of religious doctrines or religious scripture, and they get labeled heretics and kind of get kicked out. And I think in the same way, one can argue that this is what happens and why questioning Neo-Darwinism is met with such considerable hostility. But there's another function that it solves. Neo-Darwinism functions to give people a sense of certainty about their beliefs. And as a result, when you question this, I think it's very clear that people are going to react very in a hostile sort of manner. And I think, religious people do this all the time. You question the orthodoxy of their scriptures. Well, is it really possible if this happened? And people are going to be hostile because you're questioning something that actually is very near and dear to them because it functions as a sense of comfort, as a sense of certainty. The problem, I think, that comes about here is fundamentalism. And if you've seen my video on anti-intellectualism in Christianity, you'll know I have criticisms of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a form of religion, especially Islam or Protestant Christianity, that upholds belief in the strict, literal interpretation of Scripture. So this makes sense, right? Belief in strict, literal interpretation. And if you notice here in this idea of certainty, strict and literal. And I think as a result, it's fair to say that there's fundamentalism in Neo-Darwinism. Fundamentalism and Neo-Darwinism, I'm going to define this as a form of religion that upholds a belief in the strict, literal interpretation of scientific findings rather than being able to follow the evidence where it leads. And if you've seen that video, you know there's a paper that says lower intelligence is most associated with higher levels of fundamentalism. Is it really a stretch to think that this doesn't apply to Neo-Darwinism either? If this applies to religious belief, why not think this applies to Neo-Darwinism that functions like a religious belief to people that may not explicitly align themselves to a religion or not? And here's a naturalistic theory, right? Fundamentalist Neo-Darwinism allows people, often people outside the scientific community, to align themselves with orthodoxy and power and therefore signal reproductive advantage. Why do I say this? If you accept naturalism, this would provide an undercutting defeater for one's own belief in the specific type of Neo-Darwinism. Very similar to how naturalistic theories about evolution will create these sorts of undercutting defeaters for religious belief, saying it serves some sort of function. Here is taking this naturalistic theory and applying it to Neo-Darwinism or fundamentalist Neo-Darwinism to maybe explain why there's so much hostility to asking what are valid questions. There are people that ask very valid questions to religious institutions and religious orthodoxy, like, hey, is it really plausible to think God could have done this, or is this really a fair idea? That's a fair question to ask. And then also asking the question, is it really fair to think that natural selection alone could account for this and this, or that this could be something we would expect to see probabilistically under these two things alone? Once again, both of these questions are often met with hostility, but they're met with hostility under this sort of fundamentalist sort of picture. So I think the issue here, it's not religion, it's not Neo-Darwinism. The issue here is fundamentalism. It's this idea of strict literal interpretations rather than necessarily being open-minded and following the evidence where it leads. So let's talk about the big picture here. I don't think people should be questioning the legitimacy of natural selection or mutation. I think these things have been proven empirically to occur. But I think we should be skeptical of the sufficiency of these theories alone. Otherwise, we may ignore evidence that could lead us to a better theory in the future or a more encompassing theory. But I think part of the issue here is scientists, and including a lot of non-scientists, who don't understand philosophy of science, and they allow their belief in the sufficiency of these things to function as a sort of religion. And one of the problems this has is it makes researchers look like factory workers. All right, you're a researcher, you're really great at making knickknacks, coming up with these little theories, but don't come over and talk to us when you're talking about metaphysical or truth sort of claims, because you can't function. Don't try to tell me how to run the company. Keep making knickknacks. And unfortunately, I think when researchers do this, when scientists do this, when people representing sort of scientific education or communication do this, it undermines the authority of science. And I will tell you, as a scientific researcher and not a philosopher, I think it is these people who undermine the authority of science, the very thing they wish to uphold. I think scientists should really be engaging with philosophy, they need to be engaging with metaphysics, and they need to be listening to what these other fields have to say. So once again, I think this is part of the problem here, is realizing that what is it that makes science science? What is it about scientific theories that happen? I know when I'm a professor, I'm going to force all of my students, force is a strong word, but I'm going to really encourage them, and if they want to get a PhD with me, they're going to have to take philosophy of science, because I think if they're going to be speaking as an authority on this topic, they need to really understand the context of this theory and what the thought is. But really the main problem here is just engagement. Are scientists really engaging with philosophy of science? Is there hostility between science and philosophy of science or not? Well, I don't know, but I think that's part of the problem. So I want to leave this with a final argument that I think will ruffle a lot of feathers, but is worth asking. Before I do this, I want to talk about Karl Popper. So Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, he came up with the idea of falsification, and he originally thought that natural selection was not science. And eventually he came around, and people argue that he was kind of coerced to do this, but I don't know. I don't have any reason to necessarily know, but he did say, okay, fine, natural selection is science, but it's very, very difficult to falsify. And he had this idea that science should be dealt with falsification. And one thing that you should know is that philosophers of science in the last, let's say, decade or two, maybe even 3 decades now, have actually tried to go away from this demarcation problem. They realize this is a thorny issue and have basically said, why assume we can very easily create necessary and sufficient conditions for what constitutes scientific research? They kind of have given up on the demarcation problem and just kind of have these general guidelines. So very interesting if you're interested in philosophy of science to look at that. But that's one thing I want to say. Here's my final argument and why I'm skeptical of the sufficiency of evolution. Premise 1. A method that has produced false predictions in the past should be considered unreliable and be met with skepticism. That doesn't mean it's completely unreliable or you shouldn't have reasons to trust it, but you should at least be skeptical. You should at least recognize that it's been unreliable and not to take its findings, take its findings with a grain of salt. Premise 2, induction has been wrong in the past. So you can look at Hume, you can look at Popper, you can look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on the problem of induction. I'll have resources. Conclusion 1. Therefore, induction is an unreliable method at determining what is true and should be met with skepticism. Premise 3, the sufficiency of Neo-Darwinism can only be argued by induction. In other words, while we can say the necessity or the existence of natural selection, mutation can be explained or can be empirically demonstrated, you can have other things, the sufficiency of this theory alone can only be argued by induction because we can't go into the past and actually reproduce the experiments, say this is exactly what happened. There's some things you just cannot know. And my final conclusion, therefore we should be skeptical of the sufficiency of Neo-Darwinism at being the only mechanisms that are around to explain the diversity of life, these other sorts of things. So anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments if you have any thoughts about the argument. Please keep it civil, but yeah, hopefully you're having fun. Hopefully we're learning stuff. Have a good one.